lovely plant behind you,
Yep.
a couple of horses over your shoulder. It's perfect. All right. Guys, I want you to meet Brenda Wahler. She's a Helena-based historian and attorney and horsewoman with a deep interest in Montana's history. Thank you so much for being here, Brenda.
Glad to be there.
She has an article in this edition of Mountain Outlaw called Full Steam Ahead, How James J. Hill and the Great Northern Built Montana's High Line. It's a good read. I enjoyed it a lot. Brenda, how long have you been interested in Montana history?
Probably forever. I'm a lifelong Montanan, and my roots go back to my grandparents and my great grandparents in some cases. So I've probably just been born living it every day of my life.
And you started studying it at some point? It became more than just a hobby?
Well, when I was a college freshman, I spent first 2 years at the University of Montana, and I one of the classes that I took then as an elective was K. Ross Toole's Montana and the West, and that was in the fall of 1980, which happened to be right when Anaconda was shut down by ARCO. And so Toole had his whole doctoral dissertation, most of his research of his life had been studying the Anaconda Company. And to say that he was fired up and charismatic was to underestimate how fired up and charismatic he was that semester, as he's teaching us that history is unfolding before your eyes. And I think I had always had some interest in history even when I was younger, but after that I was hooked.
Yeah, that's when you realized it's
Mm-hmm.
true to life. It is right here in front of you. You at some point decided you were going to write a book
Mm-hmm.
called Montana Horse Racing: A History.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know what triggered that, and I'd love to hear one of your favorite stories that you learned from researching.
Well, what happened is that I've always been into horses my whole life, and I wanted to write something about horses. And I realized that history was the way to go. And even though I'm not a horse racing person, I'm a horse show person, I realized that the racing history was where all the fun was. And that all across Montana, the history of Montana was the history of people would settle, and the first thing they did was carve out a racetrack. And so you had people, no different than kids cruising Maine today and revving their engines at the stoplights. You had people saying, my horse is faster than yours, and someone else said, you want to make a bet? And off they went. And so I discovered that it was a wonderful way to meld. I ultimately got an undergrad degree in history from Montana State, rather than I went to both schools. And so, cat grizz weekend's tough for me. I just have to hide because, I can't choose.
Uh,
But
you can't be both. It's not allowed.
although right now, cats are in, grizz are out. Go cats.
There we go.
But so anyway, when I began to work on my book, I traveled all over the state of Montana. I have lived in several different parts of the state, and so I was renewing old acquaintances, making new friends, and sometimes, going to places like Shelby and walking around the old track and watching out for the rattlesnakes and the gopher holes and the badgers that they'd had to deal with for the last 100 years. And so it was just a fun way to see the whole state.
Absolutely. And so I guess it's kind of like rancher games. It's the rancher Olympics when you build a horse track.
Well, it was actually pretty more competitive than that. People had thoroughbreds brought in from back east and from England. They had thoroughbreds brought from Australia to California to Montana. They brought in, as soon as you had a horse that roads that could pull buggies, they had trotting horses. It was a pretty sophisticated operation. I mean, the cowboys and Indians was just bored people, on the side. But there were formal tracks. We had a race meets in 1868 where they were having fine whiskey and cigars at Madam Cody's track here in Helena. It was a big deal right off the bat. So
Okay. Big societal implications.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We had a Kentucky Derby winner in 1889, and a lot of people say that win was bigger news than statehood.
Very nice. And was the gambling just rampant? Did it destroy people, or was it just sort of responsibly done?
I would say it's about the same as it's always been. There was a lot of, same thing with alcohol, tobacco, gambling. It all goes together. And I think the thing you learn about the past is that there's not much difference between then and now. People's Some people could handle it, and some people destroyed their lives. It went both ways.
And it seems, I guess, at some point it faded out from being a Montana mainstay, and now it, has other homes in the United States.
Well, in 1915, the Montana legislature banned gambling for a while. It was one of those progressive era reforms. They'd banned it in other states, even in New York. And there was about a 10-year period when you couldn't do parimutuel betting anywhere or any other kind of gambling for that matter. And it, really decimated the horse racing industry. But then I tell the story. I tell the story in my book about how gambling went away and then it came back at the right about the time of the stock market crash, and so there was some horse racing in the 20s and 30s. And what really changed for Montana was the 1972 Constitution, and that made gambling that was approved by either the legislature or by a voter referendum legal. And the first thing they put back was, horse racing. And so from about 1970 or so up until they legalized video gambling in the, in the bars in the night, late 80s, early 90s, we had a huge horse racing industry here. We had, tracks all over the state, running meets. You could pretty much race your horses from late April through October in Montana when I was growing up. And so that was just a presence everywhere you went.
So if it weren't for video slots, every town pump might have a small horse racing track inside of it instead of a casino.
You never know. You never know. We had, there was if out in the Bozeman area, the Beaumont Downs was marketed as a destination racetrack with a supper club, and they brought in bands from Las Vegas, and you could sit there and have, lobster and champagne while you were looking out the window watching the horses run. So, but
High society.
that was in the 50s and the 60s, and then we just video poker did us in.
And how did the development of rail in Montana affect horse racing?
Well, it allowed a lot more give and take. If you take, for example, Marcus Daly, who I'm working on a second book on him right now, he developed a horse ranch down in the Bitterroot called the Bitterroot Stock Farm. It had about 1,200 horses there. And he owned 3 personal horse railroad cars that had the same suspension as a passenger rail car, so they had a nice smooth ride. And he sent those horses all over the country. He sent some to California, to New York, to Kentucky, and also could bring in bloodstock from all over the world. And that was something that was railroads made possible. I mean, before that time, if you wanted to bring out really good horses, you had to do it on hoof, and rather than the risk that you'd get them stolen along the way and or step in a hole and kill themselves or whatever. So it really allowed Montana people to take their horses to the East Coast, but at the same time, especially for the harness racing world, people from places like Chicago and Kentucky and California could send horses up to Montana to race all summer long. And with copper mining and all the money that was coming in from the mining, a horse could potentially win more money racing in Montana than they could out on the coast or back in Chicago. And so in the 1890s, we had our races here in Montana were reported in the daily racing form. And you could find out, Telegraph would come in, what's the news in Butte?
So it really elevated the whole sport.
Very much.
Okay. Well, in the article for Mountain Outlaw, you talk about your grandfather working for the railroads. So you kind of come by your love of the railroads honestly here. What did you learn from him about the Great Northern?
Well, what my grandpa, his name was Knut Johnson, and he the first thing I got to do was the first big trips I ever took out of state were on a train. And so I rode passenger rail back when we had passenger rail running across the High Line. And I remember riding on a train going to Spokane, going into the dining car. I'd get the child's menu that had Rocky the Mountain Goat telling me what I, should get my hamburger and my French fries.
That was the mascot of the rail.
He was a mascot of the rail, and they had both the Mountain Goat logo everywhere, but also they'd made him into a cartoon. And so, you'd get your glass of milk or your glass of water, and they'd put down a coaster with Rocky and put the glass on it. And so you just saw that goat everywhere. And so, just what I remember was how much fun it was to ride on a passenger train and, go, be kind of scary going between the cars because it'd be noisy and rattly. And then you'd, go through the club car and there'd be the guys there sitting there playing cards kind of glaring at you. And you'd go to the dining car. I mean, it was just, you could spend your time running from one end of the train to the other if you were a kid. And it was just a fascinating adventure.
And the origin of the Great Northern is that originally there was a competition between Union Pacific and the Great Northern. Is that right?
Informally, the Union, the Northern Pacific and the Union Pacific got to Montana first. The Union Pacific was the first railroad, came up from Salt Lake and got here in 1881. And then the Northern Pacific was building east and west for a transcontinental line, and they drove their last spike here in Montana at a place called Independence Creek, which is basically if you're driving between Garrison and Phosphate on I-90 and you look off to the south where the tracks are and you keep your eyes open, you'll see this little white sign where they drove the final spike. And so the Northern Pacific was they were on a time crunch. They finished in 1883 and just kind of, they had land grants that hinged on how fast they developed. But in the meantime, you had James J. Hill in Minnesota, and he was developing rail lines there. And there he was in some competition with the Northern Pacific because they were also competing in some of the same turf. And so for a while, they had a gentleman's agreement that the Northern Pacific could work on their transcontinental line, and Hill with his what ultimately was called the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba could kind of stay in Minnesota and the Dakotas and work on rail in that area. But after the transcontinental line got built by the Northern Pacific, Hill was realized, for one thing, it was the line had been built quickly. It was of poor quality. It could not haul the kind of freight that was coming out of Montana, and especially copper ore and things like that. And so Hill begins to envision that he's going to build a line all the way across North Dakota, Montana, and go all the way to Seattle. And by that time, the Northern Pacific had also been inching into his turf in Minnesota anyway, and the whole gentleman's agreement broke down, and he headed west.
Okay. See, and it's hard for me to picture railroads competing with each other as businesses, because I think maybe it's because I play Monopoly, and I think of them as some sort of like a public utility, but they weren't. They were for-profit businesses.
Very much so.
Okay.
And the Northern Pacific in particular was kind of like Bitcoin nowadays, where there were a lot of people backing it. All they were into was making money. They saw profits to be had, lay those rails. And Hill was a little bit different from the rest of the robber barons because he actually wanted to transport stuff. He believed in farming, he believed in agriculture, he became friends with Marcus Daly and some of these other people, and he actually wanted to build something to haul things back and forth. And so when he built the Great Northern, he was really focused on building a well-engineered road, real low grade. When he found Marias Pass, that was the lowest pass over the Northern Rockies that there was. And his whole goal was to haul heavier and heavier loads and actually get stuff from one point to the other and produce a product. So,
but at that point, the central focus was cargo, right? We were not trying to move a lot of people yet.
No, it was, mining products, coal, copper, gold and silver, agricultural produce, wheat, cattle, you name it. Yeah, it was very much a freight. That was his emphasis, was freight. That's what he
Okay.
believed in.
And when he started talking about this mission of building a rail that goes from St. Paul to Seattle, did people think that he was crazy or was that achievable?
A little of both.
Okay.
They knew that when he set his mind to something, it happened. He was very determined. He was very hardworking. He did not suffer fools at all. And when there were people who said, "Well, wait a minute, you've got the Northern Pacific going down through southern Montana, and you've got the Canadian Pacific, up in Canada. How are you going to make a line kind of running in between them work?" And he basically explained that he was going to do it better than anybody else.
And
So,
the scale of it, as you describe in the article, is a little bit staggering. I remember one little factoid that during the very harsh winter of 1887, James J. Hill had 8,000 people working on his crew, and they were laying 100 miles of rail a month.
well, that was in the summer. The
Oh,
bad
that was not in
winter,
the winter. Okay.
yeah, the winter of 1886-87 was horrible, but that was when he was staging all of his stuff. And I mean, he built the railroad as far west as about Minot, North Dakota, and he was bringing in steel and contracting for timber and buying workhorses and everything else and staging everything in the Dakotas. Plus, he was trying to I think he had to build a bridge, across some of the rivers in that area. And when they did start to build, it was still a very late spring. And one of the things they were doing, because there was a lot of snow that had to be cleared, they'd use dynamite to blast the soil loose. They would grade the road bed and kind of make it a little extra high at an angle. So when the wind came, the wind would blow the snow away for them. If it snowed anymore, it would just kind of, the weather would take care of it. And there's wind up there. Plenty of wind. So there was a lot of working with the land, but by the time the snow melted, he had everything in place. And then that's where you get those astonishing rates of rail being laid. And he bragged that he built more rail in a year than had ever been built in history, and just laid it down. But
Hard not to believe it.
it helped that he was going pretty much straight across the High Line. And so he didn't have to didn't have to turn very often.
Right. And does the snow present a big issue if it really piles up? Does a train have trouble getting through it?
Well, it depends on where you're talking, because Montana has 100 microclimates. And if you're talking the stretches of road from the North Dakota border until about Havre, um, it's going to be cold, it's going to be snowy, but you're also going to have wind. You're also going to have, it's not like Minnesota. I mean, Hill was used to Minnesota, where you can have snow 6 feet deep. He'd already been building railroads in that area for a decade. And so he knew cold, he knew snow. The Canadian Pacific had built through, they knew cold, they knew snow. And again, in Montana, you do have a short season. So, he was ready to roll as soon as the ground was clearing up in April or May, builds across, and by October he's in Havre, they called it Bullhook Bottoms back then.
Okay.
So, so that was
And
part of that was part of this fast rate. He could just keep going and going and going.
and what about hostels?
Are you talking?
Were there any folks who were opposing him? Any indigenous who took issue with the fact that he was building this rail across their territory?
Well, the native people, the historians say that this was the most Indian subsidized railroad in America. Um, at the time he was planning the road, he needed to get a right of way across that land. And they called it the Blackfeet Reserve, but it included the Blackfeet, the Assiniboine, the Sioux, the folks that are now in Fort Peck, Fort Belknap, the Blackfeet Res, as well as the native people in Western North Dakota. So he basically rolled through about, 4 or 5 Indian nations to get there. But by that time, you have to remember, we're 10 years past the Battle of Little Bighorn. The tribal people were pretty unhappy about the situation, but they also couldn't do much about it. Once he had the congressional authorization for that right away, he started building, even though they really hadn't finished the land cessions that made the reservations we have today. It was sort of, he just went. And so, as far as native hostility, it was largely a thing of the past. You already had, a decimated buffalo population. You already had people that had, lost time and time again. And so, and then there were also a lot of military outposts, the biggest one being Fort Assiniboine, which is south of where Havre is today. So there really wasn't anything. His battles were more political than on the ground, and of course dealing with weather and engineering.
A lot of $100 handshakes. That was the form of hostility he was overcoming.
Yes.
Is it true that many of Montana's current population centers began as depots along that train route?
Both the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern, yes. In fact, if you look along the High Line, you look at the name of the towns. You've got Glasgow, Malta, Saco, Havre, Kremlin, Inverness. There's a joke that either the postal workers or the Great Northern workers were throwing darts at a map to name the depots, and the part of their land grant is that they were allowed to build a depot every 10 miles, which back when you had steam engines, that was where you'd take on more wood, you take on more coal, you get more water. And so they had these land grants. They had this very narrow right of way, but then they had the grants every 10 miles for depots. And that was where they encouraged people to settle, to homestead land. Hill went all over the country and abroad with samples of wheat and all the rich crops that could be grown in Montana, and just encouraged people to immigrate out here. And he had the vision that there would be a homesteader every 320 acres all the way across his line. So that's
all right. And with such worldly names, how could you not settle in these communities? They're like Epcot Center.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, it's such interesting stuff. I encourage people to read not only the article in Mountain Outlaw, but also both your books,
Mm-hmm.
Brenda. Before I let you go, I do have a quick dumb game we need to play.
Uh-oh.
I'm sorry for this. This is called the Great Northern Trolley Problem. And we do these games with every interview. But this is based on the hypothetical dilemma in ethics where you're driving a train, 5 people are on the tracks ahead of your train, but you have the option to divert onto another track that only has one person on it. Right? Are you familiar with this?
Oh, yes.
In ethics? I'm sure you are as an attorney. So this game is not about murdering people. It's about getting rid of stuff. All right. And I have a couple of situations for you to choose. All right. Okay. You're the train conductor.
Okay.
Channel Grandpa Canute. All right. So on the main track, you have a winter tourist with summer tires on their rental car. So do you keep going straight, or do you divert to the other track that has a hiker who doesn't pick up their dog's poop?
Oh boy.
You have to choose as the conductor, Brenda.
Well, I want to be like Captain Kirk on Star Trek and figure out a way to cheat the test so that I both of them.
I'm sorry, you must choose for this game to work.
Well, I'm going to have to go with take out the guy that didn't pick up his dog poop. I mean, leaving a mess. Ignorance is bliss, and you shouldn't be punished for that. But when you're a deliberate jerk and you litter, yeah, you're done.
All right. I like that. I think that's the right answer. Okay. Next, the main track has the owner of a newly purchased Airbnb in a historic district, or do you divert to the other track that has a social media influencer getting way too close to wildlife for a selfie?
Well, I think the wildlife are going to take out that guy first, so that's where I'll head because he's going to be gone before I get there.
All right. That's fair. It won't even be your fault at that point.
That's right.
The bison did it. My train couldn't get there in time. All right, last one. Main track is a person dumping harmful waste into a pristine river. Mm-hmm. Or do you divert to a group of telemarketers who specialize in preying on senior citizens?
have 2 trains and just hit them both.
Split the train in half,
That's
one
right.
on each rail.
So uncouple the engine, take the engine this way, and the other cars can keep the momentum going. And yeah.
There we go.
For heading for Mariah's Pass, you got pusher engines in the middle anyway, so just unhook the pushers and take them out both.
You know trains better than I do, but thank you so much for bearing with me with the dumb marmot game, the Great Northern Trolley Problem. That was fun. Thank you, Brenda. Hold up your books.
All right.
It's
Yes.
it's the time of the year where we give a lot of gifts. Maybe people will pick up a copy or two of your books.
Absolutely. Well, my most recent book is Marcus Daly's Road to Montana, and we takes him up to about 1882 and Butte, Montana. And I'm working on a sequel, which hopefully will be out next year. And if you're more into the horses and you want something that's got a statewide focus, then I've got Montana Horse Racing, A History.
Outstanding. Go buy that stuff now, along with the most recent edition of Mountain Outlaw Magazine, to check out Brenda's article. Thank you so much, Brenda. Have a great day up there in Helena.
Okay, thank you. And you take care of yourself.